Welcome everybody. We are already at video number 31. And for this video, this is still gonna be about all about task 1 writing, but for this time we will be talking about process tasks. So what I've chosen is this particular task which details the steps by which a PCR test for to determine if you are positive from COVID-19. How a test like this is performed. And so, uh, for process task, you can tell by the fact that it's highly illustrated. Number one, and then number two, you can see arrows involved, so you can see how where the arrows go, going from one step to the next, and then you can also see some numbers in the processes. Although not all process tasks have numbers like this. But in this illustration, you can see there are clearly three stages. So the overview here is now very easy to spot because all you need to do is to summarize all the stages involved in the process. For example, obtaining the first step in the process is obtaining a sample, and then the second step is extracting the RNA, and the third step is converting such RNA to cDNA and amplification. Obviously this kind of process task is for medical professionals. I don't think a kind of process task like this is gonna appear in the actual IELTS exam. Uh, but I just chose it because it's quite relevant for the times. So for the process task, mm, one thing to remember, another thing to remember is in tensing. So remember, process tasks indicate action or steps that are generally true. So they happen all the time. So that being said, then what we should be using is the present. You can't use the past tense for that. And then uh, for the nominals, it's still the same. It's still um, the same advice. Watch out for the nominal traps. So obviously there are a lot of nominals over here. So all of the objects that you see over here are nominals. So and then you have that legend over there. You have RNA, cDNA, reverse transcriptase, Taq polymerase, and the PCR probe. So all of those are the nominals. Watch out for them. And uh, did we cover it? Yeah. When it comes to the cluster, it's very easy to cluster. You just group your paragraphs, for example, based on the number of steps. Or maybe you can combine some of the steps together in one paragraph since some of the steps are really quite elementary, very procedural, very fundamental. So maybe you can combine steps 1 and 2 in one paragraph, and then your second paragraph is now going to be the third step. But as regards to the grammar, I did mention about using the present tense. But please make sure that you use the present tense in the form of the passive voice. And that's what's gonna take us time. So we have to talk about passivization first. So the passive voice is really a construction where the writer is emphasizing uh, uh, the act of doing something rather than emphasizing somebody doing a particular act. So I just made this PowerPoint document and extracted the lessons from Prentice Hall. And let's go through the lesson. So for the active voice, a verb is active if its subject performs the action. Take note of that term, the subject is performing the action. So like for example, I am the subject in a particular example I'm going to give. So I am lecturing the passive voice to my students. So that is the act. That is a sentence where the subject is performing the action. So the verb there is in the active voice. But for the passive voice, a verb is passive if its action is performed upon the object by the subject. So clearly, the one difference in this definition is now suddenly you have the object over here. So the action is performed upon the object by the subject. So an important thing to remember in the passive voice is in the passive voice, the object suddenly assumes greater importance rather than the subject. So, for example, in the example I gave earlier, like I am teaching the passive voice to my students. So the object there is the passive voice. The subject is I. So with that said, when I would like to emphasize more the object rather than the subject, then I need to perform the passive voice. So it really is a question of emphasis. In the active voice, you are emphasizing the subject performing the action, but in the passive voice, you are emphasizing the action being performed upon the object. So it's really a distinction of subjecthood and objecthood. So in the active voice, subjecthood is more important, and in the passive voice, objecthood is more important. So I'm sure you might be sufficiently confused by now. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at some examples. So for example, everyone loves movies. So this is clearly in the active voice. So there's your verb loves. It's in the simple present tense. The third person singular, and then the subject is everyone, and then the object is movies. Plain and simple, active voice. But suddenly, when you would like to transform this sentence into the passive, the object suddenly assumes greater importance, and this is manifested by the object moving to the front of the sentence. You know, in English, the importance of a particular element is emphasized by movement to the front of the sentence. It's quite different from other languages where some languages there really is no movement, but for some languages the importance is actually in manifested by the element that's in the back of the sentence. But that's not our concern for today. So and then the subject everyone will now move to the back of the sentence, and this is marked by the preposition by. So one particular way by which you can tell if it's a passive voice is when you see the preposition by towards the end of the sentence. And then loves now, the verb loves will now undergo a transformation. This verb is now going to be passivized. So it will now turn into the passive participle loved. And then there's your present verb to be. So movies are loved by everyone. So this is now what you call the passive voice. So if you notice, the verb changes quite radically. Suddenly you have two constituents. You have the main verb in the passive participle, loved, and then you have the auxiliary verb. In this case, the verb are, which is also in the since it's a process task, then the auxiliary verb is now in the present. So movies are loved by everyone. The auxiliary verb in the passive voice is always the verb to be. So that's like is, am, are. For the past tense, that's was, were. For the future tense, that's going to be will be. So like you can change all of those. You can replace the verb are here with all of those alternate forms of the verb to be. So movies will be loved by everyone, or movies were loved by everyone. All right, so that's the passivization. An important thing to remember as well is when I say subjecthood and objecthood, the subject is the one that performs the action, and the object is the one that receives the action. So, um, what's important to remember is that subjects aren't necessarily people, and objects aren't necessarily inanimate entities. The object can be a person, and the subject can be an inanimate entity. So, like for example, here, in the next example I'm gonna be giving, the door broke my nose. So what you see is the subject, the one that performs the action, is actually an inanimate entity. It's a non-living thing, but it can perform the role of the subject. There's the verb broke, which is in the simple past, and here's the noun phrase my nose. So you can see that the object is a person, particularly a part of the human body. And so do not necessarily equate subjecthood with a person and objecthood with a thing, because the term subjecthood and objecthood are really just syntactic terms. It just reflects the positioning of a certain element in a sentence. So you will know that the subject is in the front and the object is at the back for the English language. And in the passive voice, for example, my nose is going to go into the front. This now becomes the superficial subject. And the door, again preceded by the preposition by the door, becomes the superficial object. So when I say superficial, it means on the surface. On the surface, it looks like the object, but if you look at the construction, it is still the subject. And my nose superficially looks like the subject, but when you look deeper into the sentence, it is actually the object. And you can tell by the way the verb changes. So broke is now gonna transform into the passive voice, broken. And of course, there is a auxiliary verb over here, which is the verb to be. So the past tense, simple past tense of the verb to be is was. So my nose was broken by the door. My nose was broken by the door. This is now the passive voice. You might be already wondering by this stage, like is the what is the need for passivization? Why do we passivize sentences? So, like I said, the level of importance in English is manifested by the positioning. So, if you would particularly like to manifest or to emphasize the object, like my nose, rather than the subject, like the door, then you now manifest the importance of the object by moving it to the front of the sentence, and then you now move the subject at the back of the sentence, and then the verb now changes into the passive. It's always a combination of two verbs. So it's all about emphasizing the importance of a certain element over the other. So in the active voice, you are emphasizing the subject, but in the passive voice, you are emphasizing the object. And when it comes to process tasks, the object now becomes of greater importance compared to the subject. And I'll be explaining that later. So, but before we move on to that, that's the active voice over there. And then you can see that the subject is performing the action of loving and breaking. And then here's the passive voice. You can see that the action is performed upon the object by the subject. Now you can see in the definition itself by the subject. So that is the definition itself is passivized. Uh, you can see the construction there is performed. That is clearly the passive voice construction. Let's look at some examples. There are a number of examples. This is really the document I use for class. Hold on. It's very important to remember that for verbs, there is such a thing as a past participle and a perfect participle or a passive participle. Some verbs, for example, like live, does not change. Live, lived, lived. Bring, brought, brought. Study, studied, studied. Walk, walked, walked. There's no difference between the two kinds of verbs. The past participle verb is used for the active voice, and the passive participle verb is used for the passive voice. And it's also used for the perfect tense. That's why we can also call it as the perfect participle. Read, 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 and for run, it suddenly changes. Run, ran, and run. Eat, ate, eaten. Write, wrote, written. See, saw, seen, and swim, swam, swum, and sink, sank, sunk. So remember in the passive voice, this is the main verb in the passive participle. The verb in the passive voice is always composed of two elements. The main verb is preceded by the verb to be somewhere over here. Okay, so for example, you wanna use the example of the Titanic. So the iceberg sank the Titanic. But if you want to passivize, you now emphasize the Titanic by moving it to the front of the sentence, and the iceberg now is moved to the back of the sentence. So the new construction is gonna be the Titanic sunk, was sunk by the iceberg. Okay, remember the passive participle. Okay, let's go into the some examples. We're not going through all of these examples, but just a few of them. So I'm gonna give you a few seconds. For example, for this one, the letter was obviously signed by a stranger. Could you tell me if this is the active voice or the passive voice? So you can see that the construction, the verbal construction is was obviously signed. This is the adverb over here, and this is the passive voice was signed. This is the the past participle of the verb to be, which is was, and signed is the main verb in the passive participle. And then you can see the by. More or less, you can tell it's a passive voice if you see the preposition by. So this is the passive voice. The letter was obviously signed by a stranger. In this construction, what we'd like to emphasize is the letter and not the stranger who did the signing. So if you want to change this to the active voice, then you can say the stranger obviously signed the letter. It's a matter of rearranging the constituents. The gates in front of the embassy were closed each night. So that's the passive voice over there. Were closed. That's the object, the gates in front of the embassy. This is the adverbial time phrase each night. And you don't see the subject over here. So there is no by phrase. So it kind of makes you realize that in the passive voice, you're really emphasizing the object. So there, in many cases, there's really no need to include the subject into the sentence because the subject is not important anymore. So it's not important who does the closing anymore. You're just emphasizing that the gates in front of the embassy were closed each night. Several business people raced through the airport to catch their flights. So this is the active voice in the simple past, raced, and then that's the object, all of that entire phrase, and then this is the subject, the subject phrase. Several business people. So this is in the active voice, and then I try to watch as little television as possible. You have two verbs here, try and then to watch. This is still in the active voice. as little television as possible. There are some verbs that cannot be passivized, like raised. So wait, for race, I think you can do it. Like the competition. Yeah, I think you can do it, but it doesn't sound too common. And try. Yeah, you can passivize try, like the exam was tried by the students. Yeah. Most of the books have been chosen by the librarians. So this is really the perfect tense, have been chosen, combining with the passive voice, been chosen. Most of the books have been chosen by the librarians, so this is really still passivized, emphasizing the books rather than the people who do the choosing, the librarians. And all four of these symphonies were composed by Mozart. That one is, of course, also still in the passive voice, were composed by Mozart. You can tell the biface over there, and you can tell the passive voice construction were composed. If you would like to transform this into the active, then you can just move Mozart to the front, and the verb now becomes the simple past. Mozart composed all four of these symphonies. Okay, so that's it. Wait, you might want to pause the video at this point if you want to go through the rest of the exercises. But as far as the live video is concerned, we're gonna jump to the let's have another slide there. So this is an article talking about aspirin. So since aspirin is an object, treated as an object in this article, then you can see that there's a lot of the passive voice over here. So, for example, after 80 years of use, aspirin today is still regarded. So, is still regarded is the passive voice. Aspirin was first developed as a painkiller. That's also the passive voice. You can notice the adverbs right in between the passive voice elements. Was first developed and is still regarded. And there. He had been asked. That's the passive voice. That's the perfect tense. The past perfect tense had been asked. The past perfect tense with the passive voice to develop a pain reliever that would not irritate the stomach. Though the formula worked, how it worked could not be told by scientists. That's a passive. It's understandable that we use the passive a lot because aspirin is the very idea of the entire article. Since its introduction, aspirin has been used successfully to reduce fever. Not long ago, a new use for aspirin was uncovered by researchers. Again, the passive there was uncovered. The one major drawback of aspirin has always been its tendency to cause that should have been intestinal bleeding. This drawback now has been turned into an advantage. It has been discovered. That's all the passive. Been turned, been discovered. That's the verb to be. The passive participle of the passive participle form of the verb to be. And that this quality of aspirin may prevent blood clots that often lead to heart attacks and strokes. This is welcome news in the aspirin industry. Aspirin has survived. Has survived is a perfect tense. It stands as one of the most enduring inventions of man. That's the active voice, stands. And credit is given. That's a passive voice. Is given to a relative unknown German named Felix Hoffmann. So that's enough lesson. And let's go into the task itself. So what I'm gonna be doing different this time is I'm not gonna be writing the task, but instead I will show you a sample, a real world sample of the description of this task. So if you notice in this process task, we do not actually see any of the persons performing any of these tasks. The person, the doer of the action is not important in a process task. So we don't really need to cite that the researcher has to put the sample into the centrifuge, the researcher here is not important. It is really more the action itself that's being performed. That's why the passive voice becomes relevant in process tasks such as this. You don't see any person at all. Okay. The representation you see here, they are not the ones performing the action. The action is being performed on them. The one performing the action here is the one who is obtaining the sample, but he's not illustrated because he's not important in the passive voice. And then let's look at a actual description of this. So the COVID-19 test starts by, this is actually the description of that uh, process task that you see. The COVID-19 test starts by taking a sample from the patient's nose or mouth. Active voice. So now we now begin to emphasize the sample. If you notice, that's the object over here. It moves to the front and it is now in the passive voice. Samples are taken from these locations because they are easily accessible and are known. So are known is the passive voice. Samples are taken. And if you notice, there's no need to mention who takes the samples. They are not important. We don't need to say by the researcher or by the medical professional. Okay. The next step is to isolate RNA, pink notched lines. So that's the RNA over there. You see that? And then, so now the RNA becomes the point of emphasis. This object is now going to move it to the front of the sentence. RNA is isolated because COVID-19 is an RNA based virus. So RNA extraction is a common laboratory procedure that can be performed with commercially available kits containing the appropriate recipe to separate RNA from the rest of the components in the sample. This is all in the active voice. And then we now emphasize the centrifuge. The centrifuge is used to separate materials by their densities and plays an important role in the RNA extraction phase. So passive voice again. And on the third step over here, once the RNA is extracted, it is converted. So passive voice there into complementary DNA, the green notch lines over there. So RNA is converted into DNA, complementary DNA, via an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. That's the enzyme over there. So we need that enzyme to convert RNA to DNA. The RNA must be converted, passive voice, into cDNA because the final step of the test can only performed on DNA. The cDNA, so the object of importance has now moved to the cDNA, is now passivized, is now combined. That's the adverb now. And is combined is the passive voice with primers specific for COVID-19, red notch lines, so the primer over there. We need the primer as well. So many ingredients just to test if somebody's positive. And a special enzyme called polymerase over there, the pink protein, and a special fluorescent probe, blue line with yellow and gray ending. So the PCR probe over there. There are so many elements. No wonder testing is a problem worldwide. And the design of these primers enables us to specifically test for COVID-19, and they rely upon information from the sequence of the COVID-19 genome. So Taq polymerase and the fluorescent probe are standard components for this test. That's all in the active voice. And then we're now moving back to the passive because we will now be talking about all these components mixed together like coffee. And then they are loaded into a plate and run. They are run. Remember, run, ran, run. In a real-time polymerase chain reaction machine, a PCR machine. So real-time PCR is a standard laboratory technique that amplifies a region of the cDNA between the two primers. Uh, And since these primers are specific to COVID 19, the real time PCR test will not amplify any cDNA if the original patient did not contain COVID 19 RNA. All of that is in the active voice. If the patient did if the patient did contain COVID 19 RNA, the amplification of the cDNA will eventually reach, still in the active voice, will eventually reach the simple future tense, a level that is detected there. That's the passive voice by the real-time PCR machine using the fluorescent probe. And then back to the passive, the data is then exported from the real-time PCR machine into a computer and analyzed. So it's then exported. If the patient sample shows a level of COVID-19 RNA which is above the negative sample threshold, and all of the controls produce the expected results, a patient tests positive for COVID-19. Hopefully this doesn't happen to you. All right. So if you notice, the only times the description uses the active voice is when they are describing something, but not the process itself. When they had to when the writer had to describe the purposes of certain elements. Like for example, real-time PCR is a standard laboratory technique. So the writer had to explain the technique, but the writer wasn't explaining the process. The writer wasn't describing the process. But when the writer had to describe the process, then the writer had to use the passive voice. So I'm gonna what you can do is, no wait, I have this on there. You can pause the video at this point just to look at this process task over here, and then let's now take a shot of the entire description. So that's the first part of the description, and then that's the final part of the description. All right, so that ends the very long discussion on the passive voice and the task 1 on process tasks. You know, process tasks are really easy. You just describe everything that you see in the illustration. There's really nothing to look deeper into. It's not like you need to find a hidden cluster. You just go through each and every step of the process. But don't forget the passive voice in the present tense, the present passive voice. That's the major lesson for today. Okay, this video marks the end of task 1. We actually began discussing task 1 in video 19, and this is already video 31. So it took us all of 12 videos to discuss all the various forms of task 1 academic writing. And from this point, I will see you again. More videos are coming. Don't forget to click subscribe and support the channel so that I can continue to help as many of you as possible realize your dreams of making it abroad. Thanks everybody. For any questions, just comment on the comment boxes below. I'll see you in the next video. Bye everybody.